The turkey was still steaming in the center of the table, filling the room with the scent of rosemary and butter. It was supposed to be a day of peace, but the air felt heavy and cold. Suddenly, my brother stood up from his carved wooden chair. His face twisted with a strange kind of anger. He didn't look at me. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger directly at my 9-year-old son Leo. "He eats too much, he costs too much, and he brings nothing to this family," my brother barked, his voice cutting through the holiday music. The words were like physical blows. My son, who had been reaching for a piece of bread, froze instantly. My brother didn't stop there. He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the little boy who looked so much like his late father. "He is nothing but a burden to everyone here," he continued, his voice rising in volume. "I am tired of looking at him. I am tired of paying for his existence. Take him and leave my house right now." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I didn't move. The room felt like it had been plunged into a deep freeze. Leo's silver fork hit his china plate with a loud clatter that made everyone flinch. I could see his small hands beginning to tremble under the table. My brother's wife sat across from us, a sharp, ugly smirk playing on her lips as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all afternoon. She didn't look surprised or upset. She looked satisfied. My mother, the woman who had always preached about family being the most important thing in the world, simply stared down at her plate as if the pattern on the porcelain was the most interesting thing in the room. My father remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the wall behind us. No one moved. No one spoke. No one stood up to defend a 9-year-old boy who was being called a burden on Christmas Day. It was as if they were all watching a play, waiting to see how I would perform. They expected me to break. They expected me to burst into tears and beg for another chance to stay in the warmth of the house. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even stand up yet. I stayed exactly where I was and let my brother keep talking. I wanted every single person at that table to hear the poison coming out of his mouth. I wanted the memory of this moment to be burned into their minds forever. My brother crossed his arms over his chest, feeling powerful because no one was stopping him. "You've had it easy for way too long," he sneered, looking at me with pure contempt. "You think you can just sit here and enjoy the things I've built while your kid weighs us down?" As he spoke, a realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't a sudden outburst caused by holiday stress or too much wine. This was calculated. The way his wife smirked and the way my parents refused to look up told me everything I needed to know. This was a planned ambush. They had discussed this before we even arrived. He thought he held all the cards, but he was about to make the biggest mistake of his entire life. As my brother continued his rant, I felt a small, frantic tugging on my sleeve. I looked down and saw Leo's eyes were wide and filled with hot, silent tears. He was shaking so hard that the table began to rattle slightly. Then, he leaned in and whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" His voice broke on the last word, and I felt something deep inside my soul snap. The years of staying quiet, the years of trying to be the good sister while they walked all over me, all of it vanished in an instant. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I looked up at my brother, who was still wearing that arrogant grin, waiting for my response. I waited until he finally ran out of breath and stopped to take a sip of his water. The room was deathly quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let my anger show. I just looked him in the eye and asked very calmly, "Are you done?" My brother let out a short, harsh laugh. He looked around the table at his wife and our parents, seeking their approval. "Done? Yeah, I'm done with you. I told you to get out." He really thought I was about to start begging for mercy. He thought he had successfully cornered me. Slowly, I pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Everyone watched me closely, their faces filled with a mix of pity and expectation. They thought I was going to stand up, grab my son, and run out into the snowy night in shame. I stood up straight, smoothing out my dress with slow, deliberate movements. I didn't look like a woman who had just been humiliated. I looked like a woman who had just found exactly what she was looking for. My brother's wife whispered something to him, probably another insult, but I ignored her. I had a much larger goal in mind than winning a petty argument over dinner. I walked away from the table and headed toward the hallway where we had left our things. I could hear the whispers starting behind me. My brother's voice was triumphant now. "That's right, keep walking," he called out. I reached the coat rack and took down Leo's heavy winter coat. I picked up his small backpack, which was sitting by the door. My brother walked into the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. His wife stood just behind him, her arms folded too, a look of finally written all over her face. They were so sure they had won. They thought they were clearing the burden out of their perfect life. I turned back around to face them, holding Leo's hand firmly in mine. I took a deep breath. I knew that once I said the next sentence, there was no going back. Before I go, I said, my voice steady and loud enough for my parents to hear from the dining room, let's tell the truth for once. My brother's smirk didn't just fade. It vanished completely, replaced by a look of sudden, sharp suspicion. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice losing its confident edge. I didn't answer him with words. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I saw his eyes fix on the device, and for the first time that night, I saw a flash of real fear in them. He knew exactly what might be on that phone, even if he didn't want to admit it to himself. I walked past him back into the living room, where the large flat-screen TV was mounted above the fireplace. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for a protest. I hit a few buttons on my screen and connected my phone to the TV via the wireless network. The screen flickered to life, showing my phone's home screen. The entire family was now gathered in the living room, watching the wall. My brother lunged forward, trying to grab the phone from my hand, but I stepped back quickly. Sit down, I said, and this time my voice had a cold authority that actually made him stop. I swiped through my files and opened a video. The screen filled with a recording from a private social media account, one my brother thought was locked and hidden from everyone but his real friends. In the video, my brother was clearly drunk, sitting in a dark bar, laughing and bragging to someone off camera. It was so easy, he said on the screen, his voice slurred but arrogant. The old lady doesn't even check her statements anymore. I've already moved most of her savings into my private account. Dad won't notice a thing. My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp and covered her mouth with her hands. My father stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward. The room was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of my brother's recorded betrayal. He turned a sickly shade of white, looking like he was about to vomit. My brother scrambled for the TV remote on the coffee table, his movements frantic and desperate. Turn that off. It's a fake. She's lying, he screamed, but I was already playing the second file. This wasn't a video. It was an audio recording that started with the professional, dry tone of a lawyer reading a document. This is the final will and testament of our mother, the voice said. My brother froze mid-lunge. He thought he had seen the will months ago. He thought he was the one in charge of everything. But the voice continued, reading the updated section that had been signed and notarized just 3 weeks prior. I hereby appoint my daughter as the sole executor of my estate and the guardian of all family trusts. The recording made it clear. My brother was not the executor. He had been cut out of the legal power he thought he held over all of us. He turned toward our mother, his mouth hanging open, but she wouldn't look at him. Finally, my mother found her voice. She stood up, her small frame shaking, and looked at her son, the one she had protected and favored for years. You've been stealing from me, she said. It was quiet, but in that room it sounded like a gunshot. My brother didn't have an answer. He started yelling, throwing his hands up, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding and that I had manipulated the files. His wife, realizing their comfortable life was crumbling in real time, began to cry loudly, but it felt performative and fake. I remained the calmest person in the room. I had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. I had spent 2 years gathering the evidence they thought they had buried. I wasn't done showing them the truth. I saved the best part for last, I told the room, and even the crying stopped as I opened my email app on the big screen. The screen now displayed a long list of PDFs and scanned documents. I scrolled through them slowly so my father could see every single one. There were bank transfer records showing thousands of dollars moving from my mother's retirement fund to my brother's business account. There were fake invoices for home repairs that were never done. And then, there was the most damning evidence of all. A series of forged signatures on legal documents that required both my parents' consent. Every single theft was documented with dates, amounts, and destination accounts. My brother didn't try to fight anymore. He sank into a chair, his face gray and lifeless. My father, who hadn't said a word to me in months, finally looked at me with eyes full of shame. How long have you known? He asked, his voice cracking. I looked at him and didn't hold back. 2 years, I said. I found out 2 years ago, right after I was laid off from my job, I explained to the room. Remember when you told me I was struggling and my brother offered to help me? I looked at my brother, who was staring at his feet. He told you he was giving me a loan to keep my house, but that wasn't true. He tried to take my house. I showed another document on the screen, a contract my brother had tried to force me to sign while I was at my lowest point. It was a predatory agreement that would have signed over my home's equity to him in exchange for a few months of help. He had used my desperation as a weapon, trying to leave me and my son with nothing while he played the hero to our parents. It was that act of cruelty that had started my investigation. If he was willing to rob his own sister, I knew he was robbing our parents too. Suddenly, my brother's wife let out a piercing scream that made Leo jump. She turned on her husband, her face red with fury. "You said she was lying," she shrieked, pointing a finger at him. It became clear in that moment that even she hadn't known the full extent of his crimes. She knew they were taking money, but she didn't know about the secret accounts or the forged signatures on the will. She realized that if he went down for fraud and theft, she was going down with him. She started babbling about how she was innocent and how she had never seen those bank statements. The betrayal was layering upon betrayal. She had married a thief, and now she was realizing that the man who called a 9-year-old a burden was actually the biggest weight dragging their entire family into a legal abyss. As she kept yelling, the doorbell rang, a sharp, mechanical sound that cut through the chaos. Everyone froze. No one was expecting guests on Christmas evening. I walked to the front door and opened it. 2 men in dark, expensive suits were standing on the porch, their breath visible in the cold air. One was our family's longtime lawyer, looking very grim, and the other was a man I had hired months ago, a private financial investigator. "We're here," the lawyer said simply. I led them into the living room. When my brother saw them, his face went from gray to ghostly white. He knew the lawyer, but he didn't know the investigator until the man stepped forward and said my brother's full name. "We need to ask you some questions regarding the management of the Brooks family trusts," the investigator said. My brother tried to laugh it off, a weak, pathetic sound. "On Christmas? Come on guys, let's talk about this tomorrow," he stammered. The investigator didn't smile. Leo squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, and I squeezed back, letting him know he was safe. My mother, who had been sitting back down, stood up one last time. She walked over to my brother and looked him in the eye. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was steady and cold as ice. "You are no longer my son," she said. She told him how she had trusted him more than anyone, how she had let him handle everything because she thought he cared about her future. She told him he had betrayed her in the worst way possible by using her love as a tool for his greed. "I am done," she finished, turning her back on him. My brother's wife, seeing the writing on the wall, immediately ran to the hallway and started packing her designer purse with anything she could find. Then my brother finally exploded. He began to scream, a raw, ugly sound that filled the house. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he pointed at me and blamed me for everything. "You ruined my life," he yelled, his face turning a dark purple. "You couldn't just stay in your place. You had to dig and poke until you destroyed everything." I finally raised my voice, just enough to be heard over his tantrum. "No," I said, looking at the man who had called my son a burden just 30 minutes ago. "You ruined it yourself. You chose to steal. You chose to lie. You chose to treat us like we were nothing." The investigator asked him to step outside to speak privately so as not to disturb the neighbors further, but my brother refused, planting his feet and daring them to move him. He was losing his mind, and he didn't care who saw it. That's when the flashing red and blue lights appeared through the frosted windows. Someone had called the police, probably a neighbor who had heard the screaming or noticed the strange cars in the driveway. Through the open curtains, I could see the neighbors standing on their porches, watching the drama unfold. The Christmas lights on the house were blinking cheerfully, and a light snow was falling, making the scene look like a twisted holiday movie. The officers entered the house, and after a brief conversation with the lawyer and the investigator, they placed my brother in handcuffs. He didn't go quietly, but he was eventually led out to a patrol car. His wife stood in the doorway, watching him go with a look of pure disgust. She made her choice right then and there. She didn't follow the car. She didn't call a lawyer for him. She walked away from the window and came over to me. With a trembling hand, she reached into her purse, pulled out her heavy diamond wedding ring, and handed it to me. "I'm sorry I believed him," she whispered, her voice sounding small and broken. She realized that the burden wasn't my son. It was the man she had built her life with. She left the house without another word, walking out into the snow alone. My father approached me then, his head bowed. He told me he had failed me as a father and as a grandfather. He admitted he should have protected Leo from the insults and the coldness. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked if I could ever find a way to forgive him for being so blind to his own son's greed. I looked down at Leo. I didn't answer my father right away. Instead, I knelt down so I was at eye level with my son and let him decide how we should proceed. Leo looked around at the messy living room, the cold turkey on the table, and the crying grandparents. He looked at me, his eyes searching for mine. "Mom, can we still have Christmas?" he asked softly. The question was so simple and so innocent that everyone in the room froze. After everything that had happened, the screaming, the arrests, the betrayals, he just wanted a moment of normal happiness. I took a deep breath and pulled him into a hug. "We can have a better one," I told him, and for the first time that night I meant it. My mother nodded, a small, sad smile appearing on her face. We weren't going to let my brother's darkness ruin the holiday entirely. The house felt different now. It felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted off the foundations. We reset the table together. The food was reheated in the kitchen, and the broken plates were replaced with fresh ones from the cupboard. My father helped Leo find a movie to watch while we finished preparing the meal. For a few minutes, it almost felt like a regular family gathering, but we all knew that one person was missing, and would be missing for a very long time. Just as we were about to sit down again, the investigator returned from the porch, holding a tablet in his hand. He looked at me and my mother with a serious expression. "There's one more thing," he said. "We found another account during the initial sweep of his laptop. The account was offshore, hidden behind layers of shell companies that my brother had spent years setting up. It turned out his entire empire, his successful business, his expensive cars, even the very house we were sitting in, was built on stolen money and massive fraud. He hadn't been a successful businessman. He had been a professional leech." The investigator explained that all of those assets were now being frozen by the court. My mother's eyes widened as she realized the truth. The house was never actually his. He had bought it using a loan from her savings that he never intended to repay. The mortgage, paid with stolen funds from the family trust. As the investigator spoke, the reality of the situation hit us all. My brother's wife, who had returned briefly to get her keys, whispered, "So we're homeless." My mother looked at the woman who had smirked while my son was called a burden. "No," my mother said firmly. "He is." She turned to the lawyer and gave him a direct order. She wanted the house and the remaining assets transferred into a new trust immediately. But she didn't put it in her own name. She put it in a trust for me and for Leo. The very child my brother had called a burden was now the primary beneficiary of everything my brother had tried to steal. It was the ultimate form of justice. I stood up and finally turned toward the door, but this time I wasn't running away. I put on Leo's coat again, and I put on my own. I felt a surge of power I had never known before. We weren't being thrown out of the house. We were leaving on our own terms. We were going to a hotel for the night because we needed space to breathe, but we knew we would be coming back to a life that was finally ours. As we walked toward the door, Leo stopped and looked back at the house one last time. I knelt beside him in the quiet hallway. "Mom, we're not a burden," he said, his voice stronger now. I looked at him and said the words I wanted him to remember for the rest of his life. "No, Leo. We were never the burden. We were just standing in the wrong house." We walked out into the fresh white snow, the cold air feeling like a new beginning. We were stronger than we had been 3 hours ago. We were finally free from the lies. We were unbreakable. The investigation into my brother's finances revealed even more than we expected. Over the next few weeks, the paper trail showed he had been planning to sell our parents' home and move them into a low-quality assisted living facility while he kept the profits. He had calculated every move to maximize his own gain while minimizing the lives of everyone else. But because I didn't beg that night, and because I let him finish talking, he gave me exactly what I needed: the time for the investigator to finalize the digital trace. Justice wasn't just about the money. It was about the truth coming to light in front of the people he tried to deceive. My parents are now living safely, and Leo knows that his value isn't defined by the words of a cruel man. Today, Leo and I live in a home where no one is ever called a burden. We spent our next Christmas with my parents, but the atmosphere was completely different. There were no smirks, no hidden agendas, and no silent contempt. My brother is still dealing with the legal consequences of his choices, and his empire has completely vanished. Sometimes, the best thing you can do when someone tries to push you out is to stand your ground and wait for them to trip over their own lies. We walked away that night with more than just our dignity. We walked away with a future that was no longer built on someone else's greed. We are finally home.